Hi, Ben with Novelux Stereophonic. Thanks for stopping by the channel. In recent videos, I've been exploring the performance of the VTA driver circuit for the ST-70 with various negative feedback and bias levels. And up until this point, we've just been looking at bench test results for THD plus N, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So in this video, I'm going to be doing some listening tests on this amplifier. The listening space in my current location is less than ideal, so I reached out to my friend Pedro Diaz, and we set up an evening to listen to the ST-70 at his place. Pedro is a professional musician. He plays English horn and oboe at the Metropolitan Opera. He has a really good ear, and his daily exposure to real-life acoustic instruments makes him particularly valuable in identifying subtle differences in audio electronics. Pedro also has a YouTube channel, and I'm going to link to that in the description below if you want to check out some of his content. Pedro's listening room is well treated, and it's loaded full of interesting pieces of hi-fi equipment. Both really modern, cutting-edge stuff and super historical collectible stuff. It's just a really cool spot to hang out. Pedro is a huge quad ESL fan, so we opted to use his 2805s as our primary listening speaker for these tests. For the source, we used a Meridian 207. This is a super cool two-piece CD player, so it's a really nice bulky drive transport mechanism, and the second chassis is a DAC preamp. And it has a variable output, which is really convenient for our testing. So we were able to use the variable pre-out in the CD player to change the volume level so that we didn't have to add another preamp to the signal path. Since the 2805s are 16 ohm nominal, I needed to open up the ST-70 and take the output tap from 8 ohm and switch it over to 16 ohm for optimal power transfer. The primary focus of the listening session was the function of the negative feedback switch that I installed in place of the stereo mono switch on the front of the amp. In the up position, a 7.5K negative feedback resistor is selected, which runs the VTA board at the level recommended by the manufacturer, providing approximately 13 dB of negative feedback. In the down position, a 3.3K resistor is selected, which increases the amount of negative feedback, improving the distortion performance of the amplifier at the expense of gain. Since there's a drop in the volume when using the 3.3K setting, we needed to compensate during listening tests by increasing the signal from the Meridian CD player proportionally. We used a pink noise test track and SPL meter to determine the necessary amount of compensation, which we observed during the tests. VTA recommends biasing the output tubes at 40 milliamps each. However, my bench testing showed that the amplifier performed much better when biased at 50 milliamps per tube, so we started at the higher bias level for our initial testing. We started out with some casual listening tests just to get an idea of how the negative feedback control affected the sound in general. And our initial impressions were that it definitely did something to the bass. So Pedro described it as sounding fuller and broader on the 7.5K setting. And my analysis of the 7.5K setting was that the bass sounded a little bit sluggish and muddy. So we kind of used that as a kind of a springboard to go into some more focused critical listening. The first critical listening track that we used was just the two of us from the MoFi release of Bill Withers' Greatest Hits. So the way that we ran this test is we flipped the switch in real time. So if it was in the 3.3K position, we would up it to 7.5K and then grab the remote and notch down the volume a couple ticks to get the gain to equal out. So we were comparing apples to apples. And what would happen is every time we switched from 3.3K to 7.5K, the level would obviously increase. And we couldn't get to the remote fast enough to adjust it down because when the volume was high in the 7.5K setting, it was a little bit harsh and not very pleasant to listen to. If we bring it down a little bit, it evened out and it was fine. But it wasn't like the 3.3K setting. When we went to 3.3K, you could continue to raise the volume and just keep raising it. It would sound better and better and better. So it seemed like on the 7.5K setting, with the low amount of negative feedback, there was some sort of harshness to the signal as you increased in output power. And we didn't have that issue when we were in the 3.3K position. After listening to just the two of us, we were starting to hone in on the proper way to describe the difference in these two settings and what we were hearing. But Pedro wanted to listen to some strings to kind of flesh out our description. So the next test track that we used was from Vivaldi's Violin Concertos. We listened to the first movement of the concerto in E minor. I let Pedro take the lead on this next track and just kind of try to absorb everything that he was describing about what he was hearing. So on the 7.5K setting, he said that the treble was edgy and metallic, and that something was not quite right in the 3 to 4 kilohertz range. He also described it as lacking focus. When we switched to the 3.3K setting, he said the instrumentation sounded more natural or more correct, and it was a bit more delicate and transparent. And just like with the Bill Withers track, we felt that we could increase the volume on the 3.3K setting and it wasn't going to fatigue us. In the 7.5K setting, as we increased the volume level, that harshness that we were noticing in the treble was starting to become more and more apparent. The final critical listening track that we used was the third movement of Respeghi's Fountains of Rome. And Pedro uses this track to test DACs a lot because it's very dense and it has a lot of dynamic range. So he specifically asked me to focus on the interplay between the trumpets and the trombones and also how the orchestra blended in general. On the 3.3K setting, the interplay between the trumpet and the trombone was very good. We could clearly hear each instrument, and then when it got very dense in texture, the orchestra wasn't hidden behind the brass. You could still perceive everything that was going on in the background. When we went to the 7.5K setting, the brass seemed fine, but some of the detail in the orchestra got lost behind the brass. And this led to kind of the best descriptor, I think, that Pedro came up with for the evening, which was that he said on the 7.5K setting, imagine that you're looking through a camera lens and it's just moved slightly out of focus. You can still see everything, everything's there, but it's just not quite right. And then when we flipped it to the 3.3K setting, it's like you took the lens and moved it into the perfect focus where you can see everything clearly, everything sounding pretty much exactly how it's supposed to, where the 7.5K setting is a little bit colored. At the end of the testing, Pedro also mentioned that he noticed kind of a phasey sound going on with the 7.5K setting, almost like you were activating a subtle surround processor or something, adding a little bit of echo. So that was an interesting observation. And this was across the board. So after we did this track, we went back and listened to a few different ones. And once we kind of perceived what this switch was doing, could describe it properly, we could listen for that and notice that across the board, we had these same results. So let me kind of summarize everything that we learned from that testing. We preferred the 3.3K setting in every instance. There wasn't really a lot to complain about. Everything sounded right. It was very precise. Bass was there. It was tight and accurate. When we flipped to the 7.5K setting, it didn't sound bad. It just sounded different in a way that it was broader, more bassy. It had that little bit of phasey effect. It was pleasant to listen to. It just wasn't as precise and accurate. So it really, I think, comes down to preference. Somebody that likes a lot of bass might not like the 3.3K setting. They'll be like, well, I need a little bit more bass. So that could help with that. And this, again, we're listening to one single set of speakers, these ESLs. So take this with a grain of salt, but it was interesting that we were able to notice a clear difference between these two settings, and shows that the negative feedback, maybe the distortion isn't everything, but there's other parameters that are being affected, maybe related to frequency response or phase, that are also playing into this. And having that increased negative feedback, at least to me and Pedro's ears, seemed to help the performance of this circuit. Just going through the 7.5K versus 3.3K negative feedback experiments took quite a bit of time, so we didn't have time to experiment with other variables like solid state versus tube rectifier, but one test that I really wanted to get done was comparing 50 milliamp bias to 40 milliamp bias. So what I did is bias this down to 40 milliamps, and then we repeated a lot of the listening tests that we did while flipping this control. And what we noticed is that all our observations from the first set of tests held, nothing really changed. And in fact, our perception of the sound didn't change at all. In other words, lowering the bias on this, we couldn't perceive a difference in the sound. It still sounded really, really good, especially on the 3.3K setting at 40 milliamps. And I think what's probably happening here is when we reduce the bias, what it was doing in the test results was limiting the output power level at 1% THD plus N. So when we go up to 50 milliamps, we can get the maximum power this amplifier can produce, about 35 watts, before it even hits 1%. And it was much more limited at the 40 milliamp level. But I think in a normal listening space where you're not cranking things up, you're never going to get the levels where that distortion will come into play. And we really couldn't hear a difference. So the takeaway on that is, if you want the maximum performance out of the amplifier, bias it up. If you want the maximum tube life, you're not going to sacrifice a whole lot, I don't think, by going down to 40 milliamps. There's probably a change, but it's just not perceptible enough to hear. It's not like the feedback, which was a night and day change. It was so subtle we couldn't even identify a difference in the sound. One of the interesting things that we did during this test was when I biased this down to 40 milliamps and we had it in the 7.5K position, that's exactly how we ran it when we did the VTA versus stock ST-70 comparison. And when we listened to Janis, Joplin, Mercedes, I specifically had the comment that this is too harsh and bright and I almost don't want to listen to that amplifier. And that was kind of what we noticed on all of the test tracks that we did with the strings and stuff. And taking it down to the 3.3K was able to take the edge off. So I think if somebody is listening to their VTA ST-70 and thinking it's a little bit too harsh or too bright, adjusting that negative feedback might be the trick to bring this into a level that's more pleasing to your ear. So we did some bonus testing at the end. There were just certain things we were curious about that were like, we have to do this test while we have this amplifier here. So one of the things we did was changed out the speaker. So Pedro had a pair of very nice quad ESL 57s, so we put those in place of the other speakers and listened on those for a while. And man, what an amazing speaker. If you've never had the pleasure of listening to a quad electrostatic, you should try to do it at some point in your life. The speakers are so physically intimidating. They're big in the room, they take up a lot of space, but when you play music through them with a good quality amplifier, the speakers almost disappear and you get this beautiful center image with really excellent mid-range. It was just a pleasure to listen to, and the VTA ST-70 did an excellent job driving those speakers. So that was one observation we had on the ESL 57s. And Pedro also made a comment that he was surprised that this amplifier did so well with the 2805s. So those speakers are usually a little bit harder to drive and they prefer solid state amplification, but the VTA ST-70 did not disappoint with those speakers either. The last thing that we tried was a ultra linear versus triode mode test, just a super quick one. So we did this with the ESL 57s and we flipped it into triode mode, and we were listening to some Chet Baker on vinyl. At this point we were just having fun, and that was just a great experience as well, listening to to analog media on the ST-70 in triode mode. It was just a different sound, and Pedro described it as just sounding correct for like 1950s music. We had just a really good time listening to that. So that's going to bring this video to an end. I hope these listening tests added some context to the test results in my previous videos and might help you guys make a decision about whether or not to go with a VTA circuit, and then if so, if there's any modification that you'd like to do to add some more features or fine-tune the sound a little bit. So thanks again for stopping by the channel. I really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next one.